The passport tore cleanly in half. Sarah watched the pieces flutter to the terminal floor as 200 passengers stared in horrified silence, their phones already recording what would become the most expensive 15 seconds in airline history. The sound of ripping paper echoed through LAX like a death sentence, and whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. But Sarah Olivia didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even flinch. She just stood there with an almost serene expression, watching her destroyed passport settle near her designer luggage, while her dark eyes held something the flight attendant couldn't recognize, something that should have terrified Amanda Morrison. Because Amanda had just destroyed the wrong woman's documents, humiliated the wrong passenger, and picked a fight with someone who possessed the power to reshape an entire industry. This wasn't just about one woman's humiliation. This was about a system 15 minutes away from complete annihilation. Have you ever witnessed an act so cruel that you knew someone's entire world was about to change forever? 20 minutes earlier, Sarah Olivia had walked through LAX Terminal 4 with the quiet confidence that comes from flying over 300,000 miles annually, a number that puts you in the top 0.1% of travelers worldwide, the kind of status that airlines protect with religious fervor. Her black Hermes carry-on, unmarked despite crossing 6 continents in 30 days, rolled silently behind her while she mentally reviewed the quarterly discrimination reports that had been landing on her desk with disturbing frequency. Amanda Morrison spotted her immediately. 15 years of gate duty had taught Amanda to identify passengers who didn't belong, and this woman's serene composure amid the chaos of international departures triggered every carefully cultivated bias Amanda possessed. Sarah moved toward the first-class counter with measured steps, her charcoal blazer and dark jeans whispering wealth rather than screaming it, unaware that her presence had just activated what behavioral psychologists call confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm pre-existing beliefs. "Excuse me, miss." Amanda's voice sliced through ambient airport noise with practiced authority, positioning herself directly in Sarah's path. Her badge caught fluorescent light as she deployed what customer service training calls the compliance stance, body language designed to establish dominance. "I need to see your documents." Sarah paused, her dark eyes meeting Amanda's with quiet curiosity, recognizing the tone from dozens of similar encounters she'd witnessed during her unannounced quality assessments. "Of course." She reached into her leather portfolio, fingers brushing past business cards bearing titles Amanda couldn't see, past official airline documentation that would have ended this confrontation instantly, before extracting her passport and boarding pass with deliberate calm. Amanda's expression hardened, despite the document's obvious legitimacy. According to civil rights attorneys, this moment represents a critical decision point where personal bias overrides professional training. "This seat assignment," she announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "there seems to be some kind of error." "I don't believe there's an error," Sarah replied steadily, making no move to argue because she'd learned from 2 decades in customer experience that escalation only validates an aggressor's position. Instead, she waited with the patience of someone who had seen this scenario play out in boardrooms, courtrooms, and congressional hearings. "People like you always try to sneak into first class with fake documents." Amanda's voice rose another decibel, unconsciously deploying what sociologists term othering language, verbal patterns designed to establish group membership and exclusion. Phones emerged from purses as passengers sensed drama unfolding. A teenage girl started recording. An elderly businessman looked up from his Wall Street Journal. A young mother pulled her children closer while keeping her camera focused, instinctively understanding she was witnessing something significant. Sarah's composure never wavered, though she made a mental note that this interaction was following the exact pattern described in Harvard Business School's landmark study on service discrimination, public humiliation designed to reinforce social hierarchies. "I understand your concern," she said quietly, reaching for her phone in a movement so subtle Amanda barely registered it. "May I make a quick call?" "You can make all the calls you want, but you're not boarding this aircraft with suspicious documentation." Amanda held Sarah's passport higher, examining it under harsh gate lighting, while unaware that federal aviation regulations actually prohibit airline employees from retaining passenger documents without specific cause, a detail that would prove crucial in tomorrow's legal proceedings. The crowd expanded as Sarah finished her brief call, speaking only her first name and the word documentation to someone who answered on the first ring. Gate agents from neighboring counters glanced over. Security personnel began walking their direction, drawn by the growing commotion that social media analytics would later measure at 200 direct witnesses and 15 million secondary viewers. 45 minutes until boarding, Amanda announced with theatrical precision, and I'm not about to let someone with questionable documents delay this flight. She addressed the crowd directly, feeding off their attention. This is exactly why we have security protocols. Sarah opened her portfolio wider, allowing business cards to become visible. Cards bearing airline logos, executive titles, phone numbers with extensions that seasoned employees would recognize immediately. The elderly businessman at Gate 66 squinted, trying to read the embossed text from 20 feet away. The young mother with the camera caught a glimpse of something that made her stop recording and stare, her expression shifting from entertainment to concern. "I really do need to be on this flight," Sarah said, her tone carrying the first hint of urgency, not desperation, but the urgency of someone whose absence from tomorrow's board meeting would trigger consequences Amanda couldn't imagine. Not happening with destroyed documentation. Amanda's declaration carried the weight of 15 years' unchecked authority, her confidence building with each passing second as she prepared to deliver what crisis management experts would later classify as a reputation-ending event, a single action that destroys decades of careful reputation building in mere moments. That's when Amanda Morrison, senior flight attendant with commendations for customer service excellence, made the decision that would cost her career, her pension, and her industry standing. She took Sarah Olivia's pristine passport and tore it cleanly in half. The sound echoed through the terminal like a gunshot. 200 passengers witnessed the moment that would generate 47,000 news articles, spawn congressional hearings, and fundamentally reshape airline customer service protocols. Phones captured every second while social media algorithms prepared to amplify this 15-second clip into a cultural phenomenon. Sarah looked down at her passport pieces scattered near designer luggage, her expression unchanged. Not shocked, not angry, just observant, as if taking mental notes for the comprehensive report that would dismantle careers and transform policies. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed this way?" Her quiet question carried across the silent terminal with the weight of someone who knew exactly what came next. Amanda felt a sudden chill, but it was too late. Sarah Olivia was reaching into her portfolio again, and this time, 200 witnesses were holding their breath. Gate Supervisor Mark Williams arrived at exactly 6:52 p.m., his radio crackling with reports that made his blood run cold. The incident was already trending on Twitter under #PassportShredded with over 50,000 views in 8 minutes. Mark had spent 12 years learning that supporting staff publicly was survival rule number 1. But something about this passenger's unnatural calm was triggering every instinct he'd developed since his last disciplinary review. "What's the situation?" Mark positioned himself beside Amanda, though his eyes never left Sarah's face. She was making another phone call, speaking so quietly he caught only fragments. "Terminal 4. Yes, documented. They're escalating." The way she said "they're escalating" sent ice through his veins, like someone checking items off a predetermined list. "Suspicious passenger attempted to board with fraudulent documents," Amanda explained, her confidence surging with backup present. "When I exposed the fake passport, she became hostile and uncooperative." The lie flowed smoothly, but Mark noticed sweat beading on Amanda's forehead despite the terminal's air conditioning. Sarah ended her call and looked directly at Mark with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about my documentation." Her voice carried something Mark couldn't identify, not desperation, not anger, but the tone of someone who knew exactly how this would end. "Ma'am, destroying federal documents is serious," Mark replied, though his training manual was screaming warnings about unannounced quality assessments and executive audits. "We'll need TSA verification for identity confirmation." Even as he spoke, he was mentally calculating the cost of being wrong, the price of supporting Amanda if this passenger turned out to be exactly who her business cards claimed. The crowd had swollen to nearly 80 people. Passengers missed connecting flights to watch. Gate agents abandoned their posts. A CNN stringer was setting up equipment drawn by social media algorithms that had identified this as breaking news. The teenage girl who'd been recording since the beginning whispered to her friend, "This is going to be huge. Like, lawsuit huge." TSA agent Rodriguez arrived with the exhausted expression of someone handling his fourth passenger dispute since lunch. He surveyed the scene, scattered passport pieces, growing crowd, multiple cameras, and felt his stomach clench. These situations either ended quietly or exploded into federal investigations with no middle ground. "I need identification and boarding documentation," Rodriguez announced, unconsciously stepping into the same trap that had already destroyed 2 careers. Her passport was destroyed due to suspicious activity, Amanda jumped in quickly. "We suspect fraudulent documents used to access premium services without authorization." She was doubling down, driven by 15 years of unchallenged authority and the sinking realization that retreat was no longer possible. Sarah opened her leather portfolio wider, revealing business cards that made the elderly businessman at Gate 66 lean forward, squinting at embossed text that read, "Vice President, Customer Experience," in gold lettering. She handed Rodriguez a card while keeping others visible, cards that would later be authenticated by corporate security as genuine executive credentials requiring CEO-level authorization to produce. Rodriguez examined the card with growing alarm. "Ma'am, this indicates you're a vice president with the airline." His voice cracked slightly as he processed implications his training had never covered. Are you actually—" "Obviously fraudulent," Amanda declared, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Anyone can print fake business cards. This is sophisticated fraud designed to intimidate security personnel." She was improvising now, each word digging her grave deeper while Sarah watched with the detached interest of a scientist observing a fascinating specimen. Mark felt his career flashing before his eyes as he recognized the platinum card holder in Sarah's hand. The same exclusive accessory given to senior executives during their annual recognition ceremony. He'd seen exactly 3 of them in 12 years, all carried by people who could end his employment with a single phone call. 35 minutes to boarding, the gate announcement echoed, but normal passenger activity had ceased entirely. Gate 67 had become ground zero for what would later be analyzed in business schools as a perfect storm of institutional bias, poor crisis management, and spectacular corporate failure. The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Social media engagement was exploding. The hashtag had jumped to 300,000 mentions with engagement rates that made platform algorithms boost the content into trending status nationwide. Local news stations were dispatching crews. Corporate communications departments were fielding calls from reporters who could smell a major story developing. "Perhaps we should handle this privately." Mark attempted damage control, but Sarah shook her head with quiet finality. "No, this needs to be resolved here, in front of these witnesses." She gestured to the crowd with the calm authority of someone who understood that transparency was her only protection against institutional cover-up attempts. Public incidents require public resolution. Amanda sensed the tide turning, but couldn't stop herself from escalating further. "Security needs to remove this disruptive passenger immediately. She's threatening flight safety with document fraud and aggressive behavior." Her voice rose with each word, desperation bleeding through professional facade while phones captured every syllable for posterity. Rodriguez looked at his radio, then at the business card, then at Sarah's serene expression. Federal guidelines demanded he investigate fraud allegations, But those same guidelines prohibited discriminatory enforcement, a contradiction that would require split-second judgment with permanent consequences. His next words would either validate his training or destroy his career. "Ma'am, I need you to accompany me for additional screening," Rodriguez finally decided, sealing not just his fate, but triggering a chain reaction that would reach corporate boardrooms, legal departments, and federal oversight agencies within hours. Sarah made one final call, speaking just 2 words that would later be analyzed by lip readers and audio forensics experts. "It's time." Somewhere in a glass tower overlooking the city, emergency protocols were activating, crisis teams were assembling, and executives were preparing for the most expensive customer service failure in aviation history. The terminal had gone unnaturally quiet. 80-plus witnesses held their breath while CNN positioned cameras for optimal angles. Amanda felt sweat running down her spine despite the air conditioning. Mark's hands trembled as he reached for his radio. Rodriguez gripped his handcuffs, unaware he was about to arrest someone who could have him fired with a single text message. Sarah looked around at the crowd, the cameras, the 3 officials who had just sealed their own destruction, and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose 15-month investigation was about to reach its devastating conclusion. "Are you absolutely certain that's how you want to proceed?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air like a death sentence, and for the first time since this began, everyone involved realized they had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Sarah Olivia reached into her leather portfolio one final time, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite 3 security officials preparing to arrest her in front of 90 witnesses and a dozen recording devices. The CNN stringer had positioned her camera for optimal angles while social media metrics showed #passport shredded climbing toward 500,000 mentions with engagement rates that would trigger emergency board notifications within the hour. "Before you proceed," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent terminal with crystalline clarity, "I think you should know exactly who you're about to arrest." She withdrew a business card, not the one Rodriguez had already examined, but a different one. Heavier stock, platinum edges catching fluorescent light like a blade. Amanda stepped forward aggressively, her 15 years of unchecked authority driving her past the point of rational retreat. "More fake credentials won't help you now. Security, remove this disruptive passenger immediately before she delays the entire flight." Her voice cracked with desperation, but she pressed forward, driven by the sinking realization that backing down would mean admitting to destroying a legitimate passenger's documents in front of a national audience. Sarah extended the card toward Amanda with the same serene expression she'd maintained throughout the encounter. "I insist you read this carefully." Amanda snatched the card with theatrical disgust, prepared to dismiss it as quickly as the others, but the words seemed to freeze in her vision. Her face drained of color as she read the embossed text once, twice, then a 3rd time, her hands beginning to tremble as the implications penetrated her consciousness. Sarah Olivia, Vice President of Customer Experience and Service Quality, United Airlines. Amanda's voice dropped to a whisper as she continued reading. "Direct report to Chief Executive Officer. Executive Authority. Policy Implementation and Personnel Actions." The business card slipped from Amanda's fingers, fluttering to the terminal floor beside the passport pieces she had destroyed with such confidence 12 minutes earlier. The elderly businessman who had been straining to read the cards from Gate 66 suddenly understood why Sarah's calm had seemed so unnatural, why her phone calls had been so brief, why she had insisted on public resolution. Mark Williams felt his knees go weak as he processed what Amanda had just announced to 90 witnesses and multiple cameras. 15 months of quality assessments, discrimination complaints, and customer satisfaction surveys suddenly crystallized into a nightmare scenario his worst fears hadn't imagined. He had just supported his employee in destroying the documents of the woman responsible for evaluating his performance, his department, his entire career. That's not possible," Rodriguez stammered, though his training manual's warnings about executive assessments were flooding back with terrifying clarity. TSA protocols required immediate supervisor notification when airline executives were involved in security incidents. protocols he had ignored while preparing to handcuff someone who outranked his supervisor's supervisor's supervisor. Sarah reached into her blazer and withdrew a second item, a badge case containing her official airline identification, complete with executive access codes, biometric verification strips, and security clearances that Rodriguez recognized from federal aviation guidelines. The badge that would have resolved this entire situation in 30 seconds, prevented every escalation, saved every career now hanging by threads. "I've been conducting unannounced quality assessments for 15 months, Sarah explained with the patient tone of someone delivering a prepared presentation. JFK in November, where passengers reported discrimination. Chicago O'Hare in December, similar complaints. Denver International in January, same patterns." Her voice carried across the terminal like a death sentence as she continued. "LAX Terminal 4 was scheduled for assessment this week due to customer complaints about bias in service delivery." The crowd began murmuring as understanding rippled through the witnesses. The young mother who had been recording whispered to her husband, "She's been testing them this whole time." The teenage girl who had captured everything from the beginning looked at her phone screen with dawning horror, realizing she had documented the destruction of careers in real time. Amanda's world collapsed with the crushing weight of absolute catastrophe. Every discriminatory comment, every assumption, every escalation had been observed, noted, and documented by the one person with authority to end careers instantly. We didn't know. This was a mistake," she stammered, but the words sounded hollow against the backdrop of her earlier declarations and the destroyed passport at her feet. "The mistake," Sarah replied with devastating calm, "was assuming that discrimination would go unnoticed and unpunished indefinitely." She gestured to the crowd of witnesses, the recording devices, the CNN camera capturing every word. The mistake was believing that title, tenure, and institutional protection could shield behavior that violates federal civil rights law. Mark attempted damage control with the desperation of someone watching his pension evaporate in real time. "Ms. Olivia, if we had known your position, this entire situation could have been avoided. This was clearly a misunderstanding that we can resolve immediately." His voice carried the pleading tone of someone who understood that corporate executives remembered faces, names, and failures with computer-like precision. "Could it have been avoided?" Sarah asked with the rhetorical precision of someone who had anticipated every possible response. "By treating a passenger with dignity regardless of their race or perceived social status, by following federal guidelines that prohibit document destruction without probable cause, by applying service standards equally instead of making assumptions based on appearance." Rodriguez realized with sick clarity that every decision he had made in the past 20 minutes would be analyzed by federal investigators, reviewed by civil rights attorneys, and dissected in congressional hearings. His radio crackled with calls from supervisors who had been monitoring social media, but he couldn't bring himself to respond while processing the magnitude of his career-ending errors. Sarah made another brief phone call, speaking with the authority of someone whose words carried immediate consequences. "Terminal 4 assessment complete. Full documentation required for board presentation tomorrow." She paused, listening to a response only she could hear. "Yes, media is present. CNN, multiple social platforms, estimated national reach within 6 hours." The implications hit Amanda like physical blows. Tomorrow's board presentation would include video evidence, witness testimonies, and expert analysis of discriminatory service patterns. Her actions hadn't just destroyed one passenger's documents. They had provided irrefutable evidence for a civil rights lawsuit that would cost the airline millions while ending her career permanently. 15 minutes to boarding, the gate announcement echoed through the terminal. But Flight 447 would depart with empty first-class seats and a story that would reshape aviation customer service protocols industry-wide. The elderly businessman approached cautiously, extending his phone toward Sarah. "Ma'am, I recorded the entire incident. Would this be helpful for your assessment?" "Very helpful," Sarah replied, accepting contact information from someone who had transformed from random witness to crucial evidence provider. Similar offers came from other passengers as the crowd realized they had participated in something historically significant, something that would generate policy changes affecting millions of future travelers. Amanda stared at the destroyed passport pieces while understanding that she had just created evidence of federal document destruction in front of witnesses who would testify in court, investigators who would scrutinize every frame of video, attorneys who would use her words to prove institutional discrimination. Her 15-year career, her pension, her industry standing, all destroyed by 30 seconds of unchecked bias and the catastrophic decision to escalate against someone whose authority she had never imagined. Mark's radio exploded with urgent calls from corporate communications, legal departments, and crisis management teams who had been monitoring social media engagement and recognized a reputation-threatening event in real time. But there was no crisis management protocol for what had already happened, no damage control strategy for discrimination caught on camera and witnessed by millions. Sarah looked around at the chaos she had methodically documented, the careers she had systematically destroyed, the institutional changes she had just triggered with 15 months of careful planning and 30 minutes of perfect execution. "Now," she said with quiet finality, "let's discuss what happens next." Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call that made everyone within earshot freeze. The distinctive ringtone reserved for CEO-level communications that bypassed standard corporate hierarchies and triggered immediate response protocols. She answered with professional calm, while 90 witnesses watched her career-ending conversation unfold in real time. "Yes, sir. Terminal 4 assessment complete. Full documentation available for emergency board session." Sarah's voice carried across the silent gate area as she confirmed details that would reshape airline policy within hours. "Media present. Federal implications confirmed. Legal review required immediately." She paused, listening to instructions that would determine the fate of everyone involved. "Understood. I'll remain available for immediate consultation." Mark Williams felt his world disintegrating as he processed the implications of a conversation between Sarah and someone whose authority extended far beyond airport operations. Corporate emergency protocols were activating, crisis teams were assembling, legal departments were preparing for federal scrutiny, all triggered by 30 minutes of spectacular institutional failure that he had personally endorsed. Amanda stood frozen beside the scattered passport pieces, her 15-year career reduced to evidence in what would become the aviation industry's most expensive discrimination lawsuit. The CNN stringer was positioning equipment for optimal angles, while social media metrics showed #passport, shredded, approaching 2 million mentions with engagement rates that triggered automated news alerts across major networks. "Ms. Olivia," Rodriguez attempted damage control with the desperation of someone whose federal employment was hanging by threads. "If there's been a misunderstanding about protocol, we can resolve this through proper channels without further escalation." His radio crackled with urgent calls from supervisors who had been monitoring social media and recognized a career-ending event unfolding in real time. "The misunderstanding," Sarah replied with devastating precision, "occurred when 3 federal employees chose to ignore civil rights law, destroy passenger documents, and escalate discrimination despite multiple opportunities to de-escalate." She gestured to the crowd of witnesses, the recording devices, the evidence that would be analyzed by congressional investigators within days. Those weren't protocol errors, they were conscious decisions with federal consequences. Her phone buzzed again with a text message that made her smile with quiet satisfaction. The emergency board session had been scheduled for tomorrow morning. Legal teams were assembling, crisis communications were preparing statements. Corporate machinery was grinding into motion with the inexorable force of institutional survival instincts. 20 minutes later, Corporate Vice President Michael Harrison arrived with the pale complexion of someone who had been pulled from dinner to manage a reputation-threatening crisis. His BMW had violated multiple traffic laws racing from downtown LA, while his legal team provided updates via conference call that grew more terrifying with each passing mile. "Sarah." Michael's greeting carried the careful tone of someone addressing a colleague who held catastrophic leverage over his career. I understand there's been an incident requiring immediate corporate intervention. His eyes swept across the crowd, the cameras, the evidence of systematic failure that would dominate tomorrow's news cycles and trigger federal investigations. An incident is an unfortunate miscommunication, Sarah corrected with the authority of someone whose documentation would reshape industry standards. This was systematic discrimination captured by multiple witnesses, recorded by numerous devices, and escalated by 3 employees who ignored federal guidelines despite repeated opportunities to comply. Her voice carried the weight of 15 months' investigation and documentation that would prove institutional patterns rather than isolated mistakes. Michael turned toward Amanda with the expression of someone delivering a death sentence. "Ms. Morrison, you're terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Legal will contact you regarding document destruction charges and civil rights violations." His words echoed through the terminal with finality that made the crowd murmur with satisfaction at justice being served swiftly and publicly. 15 years of service, Amanda began, but Michael cut her off with corporate efficiency. 15 years of documented complaints, bias incidents, and discriminatory behavior that created legal liability exceeding your lifetime earnings. He handed her a termination letter prepared by legal teams who had been monitoring the situation through social media feeds. Your pension is forfeited, references will reflect termination for cause, industry blacklist is effective immediately. Mark Williams received similar treatment, though his termination included additional penalties for supervisory failure and crisis mismanagement. Your employee handbook contained explicit warnings about executive assessments, civil rights compliance, and escalation protocols, Michael explained with the precision of someone reading from legal documentation. Ignoring those warnings while supporting discriminatory behavior constitutes willful negligence. Rodriguez faced federal employment consequences that extended beyond corporate authority, but his immediate suspension and investigation would begin within hours, as TSA supervisors arrived to manage the federal implications of his participation in document destruction and discriminatory enforcement. The board meeting tomorrow will address systematic reforms, Sarah announced to the assembled crowd and cameras, ensuring her words would reach the millions following the story through social media. Comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing employees, monitoring systems for discrimination detection, rapid response protocols for civil rights violations, and performance metrics that include diversity sensitivity requirements. Michael nodded with the enthusiasm of someone whose career depended on enthusiastic compliance. Budget allocation of $50 million for implementation, timeline of 30 days for initial rollout, federal oversight acceptance for compliance monitoring. He was essentially surrendering corporate autonomy to avoid the congressional hearings and Department of Justice investigations that would destroy the company's reputation permanently. Sarah opened her portfolio one final time, revealing documentation that made Michael's face go white with terror. 15 months of assessment data, 127 discrimination incidents across 15 airports, $12.3 million in projected lawsuit settlements, and federal investigation requests from the Department of Transportation. She handed him a flash drive containing evidence that would either reform the industry or destroy the company, depending on corporate response speed. Implementation timeline? Michael asked with the tone of someone whose next words would determine his employment status. 30 days for initial protocols, 90 days for full implementation, 6 months for federal compliance verification, Sarah replied with the authority of someone whose recommendations carried CEO-level endorsement. Failure to meet deadlines results in Department of Justice intervention and congressional oversight of aviation civil rights compliance. The crowd began dispersing as corporate security arrived to escort terminated employees from the premises, but the impact would continue expanding through news cycles, social media discussions, and federal agency reviews that would scrutinize every aspect of airline customer service protocols for years to come. Flight 447 to Geneva, the gate announcement echoed through the terminal. Now boarding all passengers. But the flight would depart with empty first-class seats and a story that would generate policy changes affecting every airline in America. Amanda Morrison gathered her belongings under security escort while understanding that her industry career was permanently finished, her pension forfeited, her professional reputation destroyed by 30 seconds of unchecked bias that had been captured by millions of witnesses and would follow her forever. Mark Williams received similar escort treatment, his 12-year climb up corporate hierarchy reversed in minutes by decisions that prioritized institutional loyalty over civil rights compliance, choices that would be analyzed in business schools as perfect examples of crisis mismanagement. Sarah watched the systematic destruction of careers with the satisfaction of someone whose methodical planning had achieved perfect results. Discrimination had been documented, justice had been served, reforms had been mandated, and institutional change had been triggered through strategic patience rather than emotional revenge. "Corporate responsibility," she said quietly to Michael as they walked toward the executive lounge, "means ensuring this never happens to anyone else." The most expensive customer service failure in aviation history was complete, and systematic change was beginning. 3 months later, the transformation was undeniable. Sarah Olivia stood in the same Terminal 4 where her career-defining assessment had unfolded, watching customer service interactions that bore no resemblance to the discriminatory patterns she had documented for 15 months. The changes weren't cosmetic. They were systematic, measurable, and permanent. Amanda Morrison's termination had become aviation industry legend, discussed in customer service training sessions nationwide as the definitive example of how unchecked bias could destroy careers instantly. Her final employment verification contained a single word that had made her unemployable across the industry: terminated for documented discrimination and federal document destruction. The pension she had built over 15 years was forfeit. Her professional references were toxic, and her attempts to find comparable employment had failed spectacularly. The viral video of her passport destruction had been viewed 47 million times across platforms, spawning thousands of reaction videos, analysis pieces, and congressional discussions about systemic discrimination in transportation. Amanda's face had become synonymous with institutional bias. Her words quoted in civil rights training materials, her actions studied in business schools as a masterclass in career self-destruction. Mark Williams faced similar consequences, though his supervisory failures added layers of institutional liability that extended his blacklisting beyond customer service roles. His 12-year climb up corporate hierarchy had been reversed in 30 minutes, his management credentials permanently tainted by decisions that prioritized employee loyalty over federal compliance. The termination settlement included clauses preventing him from discussing the incident publicly, effectively silencing him while the story continued, generating national discussion about leadership accountability. Rodriguez's federal employment ended with investigations that revealed a pattern of discriminatory enforcement, bias-influenced decisions, and protocol violations that had escaped oversight for years. His TSA termination included forfeit of federal benefits, permanent exclusion from security-related employment, and congressional testimony requirements that would follow him indefinitely. The incident had triggered Department of Transportation reviews that were reshaping federal aviation security protocols industry-wide. But the real transformation was visible in the daily operations Sarah now observed with satisfaction. New training protocols required 40 hours of bias awareness education for every customer-facing employee, with quarterly assessments that linked job performance to diversity sensitivity scores. Employees who failed bias evaluations faced immediate termination, creating incentive structures that prioritized inclusion over institutional protection. The monitoring system Sarah had mandated utilized artificial intelligence to analyze customer complaints, identify discrimination patterns, and flag potential civil rights violations in real time. The technology could detect bias-indicating language in customer service interactions, measure response time disparities between demographic groups, and generate alerts when service quality showed systematic variations based on passenger appearance or perceived status. Performance metrics now included mandatory diversity indicators that affected promotion eligibility, salary increases, and employment continuation. Customer satisfaction surveys specifically measured equitable treatment experiences, with negative feedback triggering immediate investigation and potential discipline. The metrics weren't suggestions. They were employment requirements with federal oversight ensuring compliance. Gate areas throughout the airport displayed customer Bill of Rights posters in 6 languages, establishing service standards that eliminated ambiguity about passenger treatment expectations. The posters included QR codes linking to reporting systems that bypassed local management, sending discrimination complaints directly to federal oversight agencies and corporate executives simultaneously. Rapid response teams had been established at every major airport, consisting of customer service specialists trained specifically in civil rights compliance and bias incident resolution. These teams could be activated within minutes of discrimination reports, ensuring that situations like Sarah's assessment would be de-escalated immediately rather than allowed to spiral into career-ending catastrophes. The financial impact was staggering but necessary. $50 million in implementation costs had generated savings exceeding $200 million in avoided lawsuits, federal fines, and reputation damage. Discrimination complaints across United Airlines had dropped 78% in 3 months. Customer satisfaction scores had reached historic highs, and employee retention had improved as bias training created more inclusive workplace environments. Other airlines had implemented similar programs preemptively, recognizing that the Department of Transportation was scrutinizing industry-wide practices with unprecedented intensity. Delta, American, Southwest, and regional carriers had allocated comparable budgets for bias prevention, understanding that the cost of reform was minimal compared to the expense of federal intervention and public relations disasters. Sarah's promotion to Senior Vice President of Equity and Customer Excellence had been unanimous, her methodical approach to systematic change earning recognition from industry leaders who understood that sustainable transformation required strategic planning rather than reactive punishment. Her new role included authority over all customer-facing operations, with budget allocation exceeding previous departmental limits and direct reporting relationships to the CEO and board of directors. The congressional hearing that followed had established Sarah as the definitive expert on aviation discrimination. Her testimony inspiring federal legislation requiring bias training across all transportation industries. Her 15-month assessment methodology had been adopted by other airlines, creating industry standards for evaluating service equity and measuring inclusion progress. Federal oversight had become permanent, with Department of Transportation inspectors conducting quarterly assessments using Sarah's protocols. The oversight wasn't punitive, it was collaborative, ensuring that reforms remained effective and discrimination incidents continued declining toward statistical insignificance. Customer testimonials flooded social media with stories of improved treatment, respectful service, and inclusive experiences that reflected the systematic changes Sarah had mandated. Passengers who had previously experienced discrimination reported dramatic improvements in service quality, with bias incidents becoming so rare that their occurrence triggered immediate corporate attention and resolution. The lesson had penetrated every level of aviation employment. Discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was professionally suicidal. Employees understood that bias could end careers instantly, while inclusive behavior was rewarded with recognition, advancement, and job security. The incentive structure had been permanently altered to favor equity over prejudice. Sarah stood in Terminal 4, watching interactions that demonstrated how quickly institutional culture could change when consequences were immediate, visible, and permanent. The transformation proved that systematic discrimination could be eliminated through strategic intervention, comprehensive training, and unwavering commitment to justice. The most powerful revenge hadn't been destroying individual careers. It had been creating a system where discrimination became impossible, ensuring that future passengers would never experience the humiliation that had triggered this industry-wide reformation. Justice through systematic change was complete, and the results would protect millions of travelers for generations. 6 months after the passport incident that changed aviation history, Sarah Olivia received a text message that made her smile with quiet satisfaction. A young black woman from Atlanta had sent a photo from Gate 67, the exact location where Amanda Morrison had destroyed federal documents and ended her own career. The passenger was boarding first class without incident, treated with dignity and respect by staff who understood that discrimination meant instant termination. "Thank you for making this possible," the message read. "I fly every week for work, and the difference is incredible. Your courage changed everything." Similar messages arrived daily from passengers across the country, travelers who experienced the systematic improvements that had rippled through the entire industry. The reforms hadn't just affected United Airlines. They had transformed aviation customer service nationwide as competitors scrambled to avoid becoming the next discrimination headline that destroyed corporate reputations overnight. Amanda Morrison's fate had become a cautionary tale told in customer service training sessions worldwide. After 18 months of unemployment, she had found work at a retail chain for $12 an hour. Her mortgage in foreclosure, her professional reputation permanently destroyed by 30 seconds of unchecked bias that had been witnessed by millions. The viral video continued generating views, ensuring her face remained synonymous with institutional discrimination that cost careers instantly. Her attempts to rehabilitate her image through apology videos had backfired spectacularly, generating additional controversy and cementing her status as the definitive example of how prejudice could destroy lives through a single recorded moment. Employment attorneys used her case to demonstrate why bias training wasn't optional. It was career survival. Mark Williams had fared slightly better, finding supervisory work at a regional shipping company, but his aviation career was permanently finished. His termination had been analyzed in management courses as the perfect example of how supporting discrimination could destroy decades of professional advancement in minutes. His pension loss and industry blacklisting served as warnings to supervisors nationwide about the cost of enabling bias. Rodriguez's federal employment termination had triggered TSA policy changes that prevented similar incidents systemically. His congressional testimony had been painful but necessary, contributing to federal legislation that strengthened civil rights protections in transportation while ensuring discriminatory enforcement could end careers immediately. But the real victory was measurable in data that proved systematic change worked. Discrimination complaints across the aviation industry had dropped 84% in 6 months. Customer satisfaction scores had reached historic highs. Employee retention had improved as bias training created inclusive environments where diverse staff thrived professionally. Sarah's methodology had been adopted internationally, with European and Asian airlines implementing similar assessment protocols to prevent discrimination incidents that could generate the devastating publicity Amanda's actions had created. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation into hospitality, retail, and service industries that recognized bias prevention as essential business practice. The Department of Transportation had established permanent oversight programs based on Sarah's recommendations, ensuring that civil rights compliance remained priority rather than afterthought. Federal inspectors conducted quarterly assessments using protocols Sarah had developed, creating accountability systems that made discrimination professionally suicidal across transportation industries. Congressional testimony had elevated Sarah to national prominence as the definitive expert on systematic bias elimination, her strategic approach inspiring legislation that protected millions of travelers from the kind of humiliation that had triggered industry-wide transformation. Speaking engagements, book deals, and consulting opportunities had followed, spreading her methods across multiple industries where discrimination remained problematic. The 15-month investigation that culminated in 30 minutes of perfect justice had proved that strategic patience could achieve more than emotional revenge. By documenting patterns rather than reacting to individual incidents, Sarah had created evidence that triggered systematic reform instead of isolated punishment. Her legacy wasn't destroying 3 careers, it was protecting millions of future passengers from experiencing discrimination that no traveler should endure. Have you witnessed discrimination that could have been handled differently? Share this story to show that systematic change is possible when courage meets strategic planning. Comment below with your own experiences of turning injustice into progress, and subscribe for more stories of how individual actions can reshape entire industries. Remember, the most powerful revenge is creating a world where the injustice can't happen again.